Well, guys, I'm excited to introduce John Durrant. He is a senior vice president at Capital One, and he's going to tell you a lot more about himself that I will not do justice to. Let's just say he is a brother and a successful brother at that we are very excited to welcome here today. So please give your attention to John, and after his session, you will move into small groups with other vice presidents of programming to discuss what John has shared with you all today.
Thanks, Ben. I have to say that that picture was one of those. Wow, that's the John Durrant from maybe 10 years ago. I like it though. So thanks for the introduction. And for the group, I'm really excited to spend 20, 30 minutes with you all here, trying to get things going and give you maybe some context and food for thought before you enter into the breakout sessions. The other thing I'll say as a warm up is Ben did not tell me that Stephen Hofstetler was the last version of this. So I think he has like 170 million views on his YouTube channel. So hey, nothing like a high bar to start things off with. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to talk about a couple things. I'll do a quick introduction. I won't go through everything on this slide. I tend to use this at the beginning of presentations like this as a way of introducing myself. And I'm going to talk about two concepts, actually. The first one is mindset. Some of you may have heard of or read the book by Carol Dweck. It's 15 plus years old, about growth mindset versus fixed mindset. It's something that I think is somewhat relative to this conversation as well, around creativity, taking risks. And then I'll talk a little bit about creative confidence, which is both the title of a book written by David Kelly and also sort of a framework and concept that I have found pretty impactful and helpful as I've navigated my own life and career. So I'll jump right in, and then we'll have a few minutes for Q&A before I think you all are going to break into your breakout sessions. So again, on the About Me slide, there's a lot on this slide. And it's always interesting, if you haven't gone through the exercise of trying to put together one PowerPoint slide with no or few words and only pictures that you would use to sort of introduce yourself, I encourage you to do it. Fun exercise. And it can actually teach you a lot about yourself. So yeah, sort of a couple of things to point out here. I am a Floridian by nature. I think one of the things that's probably most important on here in terms of who I am and a little context behind how I think, You're Open for Business is emblematic of the fact that I was, my parents were small business owners. They weren't college graduates, high school graduates, small business owners. And I grew up in a small business household. Real quick, I don't know if there's any way I don't know if the reactions thing's working, but if you happen to grow up in a household with parents who were small business owners, by all means, feel free to chime in and let me know. It's a really important thing for anyone who wants to get to know me and how I think about the world and things that I value. They did fundraising for elementary schools, and so that's an important piece of context. My family's got a picture here, 3 boys, 10, 12, and 16 now. One just turned 16 yesterday. So raising 3 boys, and that is the thing that takes up the vast majority of my time when I'm not working. Got a handful of companies there that I've worked for. I'm on the board of Junior Achievement here in Greater Washington, which has been a very fulfilling way to spend time. And for those of you that aren't familiar with Junior Achievement, it's an astonishing organization that I'd encourage you to look into as you think about ways that you might be able to give back. Bottom right is a picture of Jimmy Buffett. So if I'm ever asked, if you could trade places with anyone in the world, who would it be? For me, the answer is Jimmy Buffett. For some of you, that certainly dates me, but I accept that at this point. His books, I find his books amazing and awesome and captivating and just great escapes from the realities of life sometimes, but more importantly, just the love of music and travel. And I'm a big fisherman, and I grew up in Florida, and so all of those things lead me to the notion of Buffett as my desired alter ego, to the extent that we're allowed to choose those. So that's a little bit about me. I'll jump right in here, given time, to some of the content. So I don't know if there's a way to do this in the chat function or with reactions, but maybe raise your hand if you've read or if you're familiar with Carol Dweck and the book Mindset and Growth Mindset. Anybody? Okay. So let me start by leaving you, if you take anything away, if you're a reader, or even if you're not, because there's plenty of TED Talks that are on the topic and other ways of learning about content of the book, because the book is fairly dense. There's an audiobook as well. I would strongly encourage you to go and spend some time reading and learning about this basic concept. So what you have here is a little bit of at the 10,000 foot level. What are the basic concepts that are set forth in her book? And Carol Dweck she's a psychologist, right, and very famous one at this point for the book Mindset that she wrote. Researcher, clinical researcher that created a lot of this content based on years of studies with humans of all ages, kids through adults. And at its core, the probably the most I think at the time the most insightful concept in the book and in the theory is this idea of, again, growth versus fixed mindset. Intelligence, and I would say, and she postulates that competence in most things as well as intelligence. But let's just say intelligence for a second. It's the notion that intelligence can be developed versus it being a fixed trait. And what's astonishing in her research is the degree to which people, humans, at very young ages, start to sort of self-select or sort themselves into one of these two buckets, either a fixed mindset or a growth mindset. She did one study where I think it was 6-year-olds, kindergartners, so 5, 6, 7-year-olds, and asked them a series of questions. And the differences, and did not just ask them questions, but would do things like give them a question that they could all answer that was easy, and then a question that most of them would get wrong that was hard, and then ask them about their experiences. And the degree to which even 5, 6, and 7-year-olds quickly sort themselves into these two buckets is fascinating. And so on the fixed mindset side, it's the basic premise that people are born with intelligence, and there's really not much you can do about it. You're either smart because of your genetics, or you're not for the same reason. And maybe on the margin you can modify, you can do some things to change that a little bit, but at the end of the day, smart people are smart because they were born that way. And by the way, like I said, this applies to athletics, right? The notion that people are born with certain competencies that make them great athletes. For anyone that hasn't looked into these kind of things, there are lots of examples that would counteract that theory. But we have, particularly in America, we love the notion of the born athlete, the natural. Even though Michael Jordan was cut from his high school basketball team, he didn't make his high school varsity basketball team the first time he tried out for it, and turned into, I suppose there's arguments for this, but I would argue, given my age, the best basketball player of all times. And that's not, that's one example of many, many examples of people who we think of as and have achieved potential that is just outsized and have achieved the very top of their profession or career, who we often think of just having been born with the things that it takes to do that. And we tend to discount the effort and work and setbacks that many of them went through. So this notion of fixed mindset is that you're sort of born with certain traits, including intelligence. And growth mindset is obviously the opposite. So another way to think about this is how strongly do you agree with the statement, you can learn new things, but you can't really change your basic intelligence? And people that say, I agree with that, or I, on a 1 to 5, at 5 being I strongly agree, a 4 or a 5, those would be people that are generally have what Carol Dweck would postulate and call the fixed mindset. And people who would say, no, I'm a 1 on that scale of 1 to 5, or 2 would fit into what's called the growth mindset. And the thing that's important about this idea of these two different mindsets is that it has profound impacts on outcomes and the way people approach life. And so if you have a growth mindset, one of the most important sort of outcomes of that is that when you approach things, when you approach people, you approach problems, you approach jobs, you approach challenges, you're oftentimes more in a learning mode versus people with fixed mindsets are oftentimes thinking about how they can make themselves look smart. Because again, they don't believe they can be smart. They believe they either are or aren't, and that's a fixed trait that they can't change. And so it's all about, how do I show up in a certain way? People with a growth mindset value effort because they fundamentally believe that effort is the thing that gives them the opportunity to learn and grow. And if you believe that people are just born a certain way, then effort tends not to be of particular value. Really important. People with a fixed mindset essentially give up, or some version of give up, when they reach a setback. And people with a growth mindset instinctively work harder. Because again, that setback is not seen as anything other than another opportunity to learn something and eventually achieve your objectives. And the outcomes are clear, whether it be academic performance, or if you put this in the light of sports and athletics, or really most aspects of our life. The outcomes are pretty clear. In academic performance, it's study after study, very consistent results that people with a fixed mindset have lower academic performance and people with a growth mindset have higher. And so I'll leave you with that and the reason I wanted to start with that before going into creative confidence is I actually think creativity is among it might be number 2 right after intelligence, where many people adopt this notion that you're either born with it or you're not. And for those of you that watched David Kelly in the TED Talk that was sent out, which, by the way, here's a picture of him. There's nothing better than David Kelly. He looks like Mario to me from Mario Brothers. I love the mustache. I love everything about this guy. He talks about in the TED Talk and in the book, he talks about this experience that he had as a young kid. And frankly, I can relate to it, where, really early on in life, maybe it's drawing a picture or a writing assignment or, something like that in school, where it really doesn't take much for a teacher's comment or for your peers' commentary or reactions to pretty quickly plant that seed in our minds that we just aren't creative. And in a world that, especially when we're young, doesn't overly value creativity, I would argue. As a matter of fact, given sort of the prevalence of STEM and focus on math and analytics and science, I would argue it's even more the case that at young ages, we tend to undervalue creativity. It's pretty easy for someone to just sort of say, well, I'm just not the creative type. And so the reason I start with Carol Dweck and the mindset is because I think, again, it's mostly written around the concept of intelligence, but I actually think it very much applies to creativity. And I think it's really important. And a lot of what David teaches, he's a for what it's worth, I don't know if he introduces himself in the video for those of you that watched it, but he created something at Stanford called the D School, the design school at Stanford. And he teaches this concept of creative confidence. And a lot of the point that he makes is the same point that Carol Dweck makes in mindset, which is it's basically crap that we're, the notion that we're born with like some sort of gene or penchant for creativity, or we're not, is a thing that isn't true, but many of us tend to believe. And so some of the basic takeaways from it, and I know self-efficacy was one of the things that somebody put in the word cloud earlier. This idea of fear of judgment, I actually feel like in the questions that there was only 3 or 4 questions that were put up there, but one of them was basically, well, what if? I think the question Ben asked was, what are your concerns, and what are your concerns about taking risks? And the vast majority of us on this call, because the vast majority of humans, if they spend the time to get to know themselves, have a fear of judgment, a fear that the people we value, the people we love and care about, our friends and our family, our coworkers, our peers, are going to judge us in one way or another. And that fear is a very powerful motivator. And in this case, in the case of creativity, I think it turns into a motivator to not take risks and to not try new things. And so, for any of you that put some of the questions there in the beginning that can identify with this notion of fear of judgment, know that some of the basic concepts in creative confidence are part of the key to getting past that fear. So this idea of guided mastery, which I think is one of the most powerful sort of basic elements of the book, is a big part of in the example he gives of Bandura and his experiment touching the snake, right? So he gives this example about this researcher and psychologist Albert Bandura, who, by the way, is also referenced in Carol Dweck's Mindset. And he does this study with people who are afraid of snakes, right? And instead of just sort of having them come into his office and plopping a snake in their hands and hoping that they get over it, right? What does he do? He puts a snake in like one corner of a room and says, open the door, take 1 step in and take 1 step out. And then, walk in the room and take 2 steps toward the snake, but then walk back out. And over a period of time, what happens is people in very small increments get more and more comfortable with the idea that A, first they're in the room with a snake, and B, they're getting closer and closer to a snake, and guess what? It still hasn't been done. And eventually you actually have some people in his study actually touching snakes, who, just literally days before in this experiment were petrified of snakes. The concept applies and has been proven out in lots of phobias. And if you were to go to a psychologist because you felt like you had a real phobia that was impacting your life, I will tell you that, for example, my son, my 10-year-old son, who wouldn't love me telling the story, but he can't hear me. So, when he was 6, there was a huge rainstorm in the area. And we have a basement, and the basement water started coming through the windows in the basement. And of course, my wife and I are kind of freaking out. Water's coming through the window. We're trying to catch it. We grab a cooler and we're trying to catch the water, and the rug's getting soaked. So we're running around, kind of raised voices, like, with a little bit of hair on fire. And he just stood there and watched. And for 2 years following that, he was petrified every time it rained. I had a 7-year-old who was afraid of rain. And I got to tell you, it was really weird. Who's afraid of rain, right? Like, it's rain. It's, and it's funny. It took me 6 months before I sort of remembered the thing. I probably talk about this concept 3 times, 4 times a year. And it never struck me that I should maybe try to apply some of this basic concept, and particularly the concept of guided mastery, to getting my 7-year-old son more comfortable with rain. Sure enough, we actually did go see a therapist, and together, we basically had him take small steps towards getting comfortable with rain again, which included, let's just go outside and stand in the rain for 5 seconds. And I know it sounds crazy because, again, who's afraid of rain? But my 7-year-old son was really scared of rain, to the point where he would sit in a corner if it was raining. And today at 10, he's, rain is just like it is to everyone else. So I would tell you that one of the things you should think about is apply this to your roles as a VP of programming. I wouldn't encourage you, if you're thinking about this and trying to plan some things for the chapter, I wouldn't encourage you to go from sort of, and especially if you're in a chapter that's kind of got the routines where you do the same things, generally speaking, I wouldn't encourage you to like swing for the fences on your very first try. I would actually encourage you to just modify in some small way something that you're already doing to make it a little bit different. You'll probably get more participation from your chapter members, because for them, they may not even recognize the difference. But start small and build over time is the basic takeaway from guided mastery. And then self-efficacy. This idea that people are naturally creative, and it's a sense that you can change the world and attain what you set out to do. It's one of those things where you can tell someone who has a given fear that, or maybe has a mindset that says, I'm not a creative type of person, that they're wrong, and that, if they try and put their mind to it, they really can change the world. I think that it's important to seek out guidance, interaction with people who may see themselves as more naturally creative. I will tell you the other thing I'll say about myself, and then I'll open up to questions, is I actually very much identify with the notion of early on in my life kind of accepting the idea that I'm just not a particularly creative person. I'm a very analytical person, a very strategic thinker. I've got lots of strengths, but creativity was not one of them. And I never played an instrument. Music was not my thing. Drawing, writing, painting were also not things that I excelled in as a kid. And so for those reasons, I entered adulthood with the notion that I'm just not that creative. I will tell you that in my career, what I found was surrounding myself with people who are creative. And when I had a problem or an opportunity to go take a chance and take a risk and try something new, I would very intentionally bring one or two other people. Sorry, I'm going to need 10 minutes. Okay. I would intentionally bring one or two other people with me. And what I found was I may not be particularly adept at starting with a total white space and coming up with the very first idea that is creative and sort of out of the box. But what I'm really good at is sort of jiving with a small group of people and building on other ideas. And that played out for me. For those of you that are familiar with Capital One, one of the things that we're, outside of being a big, huge credit card company, I actually work in what we call the retail and direct bank, which is the deposits and banking side of the business. And we now have about 42 Capital One cafes throughout the country, and usually in bigger urban cities. And these are, we call them Capital One cafes. They're physical locations where you can walk in, and we have our cafe ambassadors, our Capital One ambassadors, and they'll talk to you about banking products. There is no teller. Lots of ATMs, though, if you need to get cash or deposit cash. They'll help you open accounts. You can also get 50% off the coffee from Pete's Coffee if you have a Capital One debit card and credit card. It's a pretty innovative concept and physical space in banking. And I'll tell you that it was about 7 or 8 years ago that there were 3 of us talking about what we wanted to do with our strategy in the retail and direct bank. And we didn't have any cafes at the time. And we were doing some sort of brainstorming around, it was largely around how would we change the branch experience? Because there's a lot of things that customers generally don't love about walking into bank branches. And it was an all-day session. And I remember I was the one that came up with the idea that, well, why don't we stop calling it a branch? Because we've been talking about the idea of coffee being part, free coffee, which we ended up not doing. But we were talking about the idea of more of a combination coffee shop and branch, but it had never struck anyone to stop calling it a branch. And I was like, well, why don't we call them Capital One cafes? And again, it's a really basic, small, silly thing, right? Although it's been a pretty big part of our strategy and the branding that we've been doing. If for those of you that have seen the commercials, we always have our Capital One cafes in the background. And it's just one example of contributing to some pretty creative thinking and collectively being willing to take some risks. And those are things that I think when I was 15, 17 years old, I would never have thought of myself as someone being able to do. So I'll pause there. I think, Ben, we're probably right at that time frame where you wanted to switch over and do maybe 5 or 10 minutes of Q&A if anybody has questions and answers before moving on.
Yeah, we have a question from Zach at Northwest Missouri State. He wants to know, as you think about self-efficacy, meaning that, people are creative, but how do you get the chapter more involved in showing up to the thing that you're attempting to be creative with?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's been a long time since I was part of a chapter, unfortunately. But I'll harken back to both my experience as an undergrad and a leader in my chapter, but also what I think is generally true for organizations of humans. I think it's important to have a shared vision for why. And so, depending on your chapter, I think it's really important for you to start with not why they should show up to that event, but what it is that you have in mind that you're trying to achieve with that event and all the other events that you might plan. And so I'd start with thinking about how do you engage members of the chapter to help create some of that vision and articulate that vision? Like, why even have a VP of programming other than someone told you should, or you had one last year, right? Like the role exists, but why does it exist? And I actually think it's pretty important for that to be like a topic of conversation. And for there to be some degree of alignment on what it is that you and the role you're in are being asked by the group to achieve. Because I think it's, in the business context, without that sort of North Star vision, it is impossible to get large numbers of people marching in the same direction. If I've learned anything, it's, the bigger and broader my job has become over the years, the more I have to repeat myself over and over and over again about why. Why are we here? What are we trying to accomplish? Before I get into the tactics of, what are the investments we're making? What are the specific things we're doing? I can tell people till I'm blue in the face of, here's our 6 priorities for the next 6 months, 12 months. Or in your case, you can tell people until you're blue in the face. These are the 4 these are the 4 events I've planned. You should come. But if people haven't been given an opportunity to engage in why, it's you're less likely to get the response that you want. So I would start with, if you were brand new to the roles, which I understand most of you aren't, so maybe as you're mentoring someone that's taking over shortly, I think it would be really wise to spend, if I were elected to the VP of programming position in a chapter today, I'd spend the first 60 days trying to engage both in one-on-one and small groups and also chapter meetings and bigger groups in some amount of dialogue around why. What's the vision? What is it that you all as a group want to get out of your experience being in this chapter? And how can I, as the VP of programming, then work backwards from that outcome? Because I think without the buy-in, you're sort of flying blind, right? I think you might actually learn something going through the process of asking why and getting that feedback. So that's my primary thought is, I think it's good. I wouldn't jump right into here's the events I planned because I know what is best for everybody and these are good ideas, but rather find ways to engage people in feeling like they have ownership in the vision, the why, and I think you'll find them having more interest in participating.
Thanks, John. We have two more questions. One of them I'm going to hold off on, and because it's going to be touched on within the small groups. Max asks about the best way to facilitate brainstorming, and we're going to talk about that directly in the small groups. But John, for you, not necessarily related to creative confidence, I'll actually make you a little bigger here. For you, transitioning from being a part of SigEp in college to the professional world, what did you learn from your experience in SigEp, and how has that helped you as a professional?
You know, one of the things that I feel like I learned from my time as an undergrad and in the SigEp leadership positions that I was in is the importance of trust. And I think, in the role that I'm in today, and I think in any role where you're leading teams of people, I think building emotional trust specifically may be the number one most important thing to do if you want to be a successful leader of people. And I feel like my time in SigEp gave me opportunities to experiment with ways of building relationships. I wouldn't have used this terminology at 19, 20, but when I look back on it, what I think I was doing was building relationships and building trust, and then learning how important, I think I learned how important that was for getting people to follow. Like people aren't going to follow you as a leader if they don't trust you. And there's sort of a basic level of things you have to do. You have to you have to be truthful. You can't lie. You have to follow through on your commitments. You have to show up on time. Those are all like basic levels of trust. But I think there's a deeper level of trust building that occurs when you genuinely show up to, and this is a little bit easier to do, frankly, in a fraternity setting than it is in a professional setting. When you genuinely show up because you care about the outcomes for the other person on your team, or in your case, the people in your chapter. So I think my answer is, again, looking back on it, I would never have used this terminology when I was there. But I think I kind of learned how to build relationships, and particularly build relationships built on trust. And that has been really important in my career in terms of building teams at a number of different companies.
That's awesome. John, thank you so much for your time tonight. Really enjoyed hearing, your perspective. And I know that after hearing from you the first time when you spoke to our staff team a few years ago, I went out and I got Creative Confidence, and I read it. And that book itself has made such an impact on my life as well. So guys, don't just stop at the 12-minute TED Talk and John talking to you about Creative Confidence. Go and find the book and read it. But John, thanks for sharing that with us tonight, and have a good rest of your evening.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me. Thanks for taking the time and for the good questions, and enjoy the rest of the day.